welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, this week, a town that was built around a single industry. Now, that industry involved an insect. The manufacturing plant was the largest of its type anywhere in the world. The town was literally built by the employer, employee housing, sewer and water, fire department, community center, and much more. It was considered, in fact, the start of corporate welfare in the United States back in the 1800s. Our guest today is Sharon Cohen, author of the book Connecticut Industries Unite for World War II Victory. She's going to tell us the incredible story behind the resourceful, entrepreneurial Cheney brothers and their factory town in Manchester, Connecticut, where more silk was produced than anywhere in the world. Sharon's going to be along in just a moment with that story. Well, this week's trivia question, one of the nation's most prolific serial killers was called the Eggman. Why? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know what we're covering next week. This is a classic story of how the industrial age produced some legendary entrepreneurs. The Cheney brothers were from a long line of Cheney entrepreneurs. Their ancestors arrived in the Americas in the 1600s with the first waves of European settlers, and the early waves of offspring rose to become some of the more accomplished clockmakers in the colonies. But it was the clockmakers' grandchildren, the so-called Cheney brothers, who took the family name to an even higher plateau. They introduced the entirely new concept at the time of corporate welfare, or corporate paternalism, take your pick. The Cheneys built up not only their business, but an entire town, where eventually 25% of the residents in town worked for them, and they provided for those workers. Their chosen product was silk. It had been dominated for centuries by the Chinese, but the Cheneys would grow their enterprise to become the biggest in the world. Here to tell us this remarkable story is Sharon Cohen. She's author of a really fantastic book, Connecticut Industries Unite for World War II Victory, which is available at highpointpub.com. So Sharon, we're going to talk about these incredible Cheney brothers and their silk operation in Connecticut, which ended up being the toast of the town, both across the entire country and around the world, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get into that. I think for people to truly understand how incredible the Cheney brothers' success was, they need to understand the difficulties that they overcame in the creation and production of silk. Could we start off, can you just kind of tell us how Mother Nature makes silk, starting with the mulberry bush and the moth?
Right. Now, the mulberry bush and the mulberry tree, they're both used, and they are the same thing. And it's a very convoluted step-by-step process. You have the seeds that you grow for the trees, but they have to be grown in a particular environment, and that has to be tropical and unchanging warm climate. So now we have this tree growing, and it has to grow well enough that it has its flowers, and then it bears these white seeds called mulberries. There's this wonderful smell of jasmine that comes from these leaves. And the silkworm moths love that smell, and they're attracted to the smell of the jasmine, and they go over to the trees, and they leave their eggs on the tree. Over several days, the eggs hatch into black caterpillars. These caterpillars pig out on the leaves for a month or so. And they then shed their skin 4 times, turn yellow, and they spit out through their saliva a very thin and delicate strand of silk. It's nearly 3/4 of a mile long. It's incredible. And they wrap this one strand around themselves into a cocoon. And now, only now, do the silk mills get involved, because they need to harvest these cocoons and extract that one long strand of silk through boiling.
This is incredible. I mean, it's when you stop and think about how Mother Nature set this up, it's just remarkable. But there's only one trick, right? The mulberry bush, the mulberry tree has to be in a tropical climate, right? And Can you take us back in time to the early 1600s when that lesson was learned very strongly?
Yes, this is when King James of England really wanted to build up his treasury. So China had a very lucrative silk business. And what he decided to do was to follow their use of mulberries. Now, I don't know if you remember as a kid, here we go round the mulberry bush so early in the morning. Well, that song, some believe, is actually from King James when he tried this mulberry tree growing. But unfortunately, he didn't understand all the convoluted steps. He tried it in England and he tried it in the colonies, and it just didn't work out. And so he failed. But others did make a go of it.
Well, you're right. And in the 1700s, New England farmers continued to try and grow these mulberry bushes, and it wasn't very successful. But in the early 1800s, something changed when I'm not exactly sure who came up with this. I assume a horticulturalist from some part of the world introduced a hardier version of the mulberry plant, one that didn't need quite so much of a tropical climate. And so a lot of people, took to this and started investing in it. It became quite a fad. And three people who invested pretty heavily were the Cheney brothers, Ward, Frank, and Rush. And they end up forming the Mount Nebo Silk Company in 1838 to make a go of this, right?
You're right. They did see this variable mulberry bush, and they did try it. And it did work for a while, but then because of cold winters, it kind of fizzled out. But they continued. That's when they formed the Cheney Brothers Silk Company. The reason why they were so successful is because they tried different things to overcome the challenges that they faced. In the meantime, they hired immigrants from Russia and Europe because they knew no matter what, they were going to succeed. They came from a long line of Cheneys, and each Cheney grew their businesses larger. And they said, we're not going to be the first ones not to do this. And Frank Cheney invented the Rixford roller. And this roller revolutionized silk manufacturing with a stronger and thicker thread. And so they were able to use silk for many different products besides raw silk. They used it for velvet. And actually, the big thing that they used it for eventually for World War I was for parachutes. But the thing that they did, and you could imagine the light bulb going off in their head, was the most important step for us is the cocoon. So why don't we just import the cocoons and forget about all the other steps? And that's exactly what they did, and that's why they succeeded and everybody didn't.
So, Sharon, indeed, that Rixford roller was a key breakthrough for the Cheney brothers and really helped propel them. Now, this was incredible how many immigrants they brought in, first of all, but the fact that they employed 25% of the population of the town of Manchester was also amazing. But they couldn't have done all this without attracting workers as well. And they did this through something that came to be known as welfare capitalism or benevolent paternalism, depending on what you want to call it. Could you tell us what the Cheneys did to attract workers?
They were South Manchester. They became the whole town. And because they were the primary industry in Manchester, and actually that whole area of Connecticut, they took ownership, actual ownership of their employees. And that is what you said is called corporate paternalism or welfare capitalism. And what that means is that the owner becomes the father and the employees become the family. And so what happened is that they built homes for the workers. They had a place to live. They had schools. They had a community center. They had gas and electric plants. They had fire and police departments. The Cheneys felt that they were looking over the needs of their workers. And this was the beginning of this whole concept of corporate paternalism, which you didn't see in the United States prior to this time period.
When you stop and think about how incredible this was, I mean, if you're a worker looking for a job in Manchester and you find out the Cheneys are building homes for their workers, and it's the first indoor plumbing in Manchester. And they're building a railroad between Manchester and Hartford. They're building Cheney Hall, and like you say, schools and recreational centers, even churches, I think, in some places. But it's just amazing what they did, and all the positives of this. There's no denying how positive this was. But there were some negative parts to this as well, from the perspective of some of the workers. Despite all of this gift giving, of, if you will, it wasn't always accepted as the way the Cheneys maybe intended.
You're right. In my book, I have this wonderful interview with a woman who's now over 100 years old, actually, and she talked about what it was like working for Cheney. And she did live in a boarding house. All her meals were paid for. But there was the other side. And this is where there was a lot of employees that left the company because they didn't like the other side of this equation. They liked all the services they got, but they felt that they had to give in many respects to the needs of the company. Many of them worked in very harsh conditions. They were 10-hour shifts, and it was very noisy and dangerous. And actually, just like in other companies, many other companies, especially mills, there were a lot of injuries and people who died. Now, they tried to bring in the union, but that was really a no-go with the Cheneys. They truly saw themselves as the father. And there's a quote here that was really interesting. It says, "No real labor union has ever succeeded in getting a toehold in the sacred boundaries of South Manchester."
And you're right, that activity was occurring in the early 1920s, the union busting, if you will, or just refusing to recognize them, because I think the workers had voted to join a union, and Cheney's said, no, we're not going to recognize that. So that battle was going on. And then what ends up happening a few years later is the stock market crash in 1929, and the fortunes of that company, along with many others, kind of collapsed, and they ended up having to sell off some of Cheney Village, all these assets that they had built, the schools, the rec buildings, the water company, all got sold off, and they had to file for bankruptcy protection. But then in 1938, and I think it's this entrepreneurism you referred to earlier about we're not going to be the ones to fail, they end up creating a joint partnership with the Army and DuPont in 1938 to form a company called Pioneer Parachute, where they finally give up silk even and go with nylon and rayon. What did they do with that?
When the Depression hit, as you said, many companies were closing down, and Cheney was having a really difficult time. But once again, they were at the right place at the right time. Even before then, they had been working with DuPont. They realized that perhaps silk parachutes were not always going to be the answer. And DuPont was looking at the fact that they could make synthetic ones. They were already experimenting, and during World War I, they made many, many silk parachutes. But when World War II came around, they couldn't do that anymore because they couldn't import the cocoons, right? You couldn't get anything from Asia. So DuPont and the Cheney brothers already are a step ahead. And by the end of the war, they were making 300 parachutes a day with approximately 3,000 people. So once again, Cheney, they overcame their challenges, and they were very innovative.
And you found out, I believe, in your research, didn't they make the parachutes used in the D-Day invasion?
Yes, yes, it was used in Normandy. Another thing is that when you go from silk to nylon parachutes, you don't know if they're going to work the same way. When you want to make sure when those troops jump out of that plane, that parachute's going to work. Otherwise, that's it for them, right? So they put out a request to have somebody test out that parachute. There was a woman named Adeline Gray of Oxford, and she was only 24 years old, but she was what was called a barnstormer. She had been doing daredevil stunts out of her own plane that she had purchased, and she was a pilot. And she said, oh, I'll try out this new parachute. So she went over to the Hartford airport, and she jumped out in this new nylon parachute, and they all found out that the nylon was even better than the silk.
And just so people know, we're talking about the original Hartford airport of Brainerd Field, which is the one right on the Connecticut River. So that must have been daunting to make sure she came down on the field and not in the river. But just incredible story there. Now, the other thing that I think when nylon and rayon came around, and DuPont, of course, were the inventors of that, it just blew silk out of the water for so many reasons, cost and whatnot. And, so, silk remains a luxury item for sure. But the number of silk looms, and I think this is a statistic worth repeating, from 1930 to 1950, now that's a 20-year period, there was a 99% drop in the number of silk looms in the world from 100,000 down to just 3,000. And, 3,000 looms is still a lot, but when you're going around the world and comparing that to what it was, it's just a remarkable drop. And with that, the Cheney brothers finally had to get out of the business, and I guess in 1955, they sold to a company called J.P. Stevens, right?
Yes, and you're right. But, a lot of the mills, especially in Connecticut, had already died out, even before the war. It was not the newest way of producing anymore. And so the Cheney brothers were one of the few large silk manufacturers at that time during the war itself. And so, yes, as you said, after the war, the mills closed. But Cheney's lived on. And today, when you go to South Manchester, you could actually see what is left of that time period. There are 278 resident dwellings there. These were buildings that were lived in by the employees. And this area is called the Cheney Brothers National Historic Landmark District, and it was established in 1978. In addition to the resident buildings, there's a mill, churches, schools, family mansions looking like they did at that time, and in one of them there's the Museum of Manchester Historical Society. And many of these buildings have already been converted to commercial use. For example, the old mill is a medical office. There's the rail trail. So it's a pathway, a pedestrian pathway. But what was really interesting for me is that when the mill closed, the Pioneer Parachute Company continued. And it was sold and went down south, and it's owned by Elon Musk SpaceX. He bought the Pioneer Aerospace Company in 2023. And so the Cheney brothers live on.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path. When the Cheney brothers' operation was at its peak, they were producing as much raw silk as France, Germany, Italy, and England combined. I want to thank our guest for today's program, author Sharon Cohen. You can get her book, Connecticut Industries Unite for World War II Victory, at highpointpub.com. The answer to this week's trivia question. The question was, one of the nation's most prolific serial killers was called the Eggman. Why? Well, the answer is serial killer Michael Ross grew up in rural eastern Connecticut on an egg farm. Next week on Amazing Tales, we'll look back at Ross's spree. He raped and strangled 8 young women, leading him to become the last person put to death in Connecticut via capital punishment. We're going to speak with the journalist who spent 10 years getting to know Ross, actually getting closer to him than anyone else, including his family, right up to his execution. Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.